Hello, and thanks for joining us today. We'll start in just a minute. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Mason Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Funders Concerned About AIDS and really delighted to welcome you all today. I use he, him pronouns, and for anybody visually impaired, I'm a white, bald, bearish guy with a salt and pepper beard wearing a button down and a jacket. For those of you who may be new to Funders Concerned About AIDS, we are a philanthropy serving organization dedicated to mobilizing the resources needed to end the global HIV pandemic and to build the social, political, and economic commitments needed to attain health and human rights for all. Today's an exciting day as we're here to share with you the launch of our 20th edition of the Signature Resource Tracking Report, mapping the landscape of philanthropic funding for HIV and AIDS globally. I'm going to just start with a few logistics before we get into the details today. One, we are offering French and Spanish interpretation. You can click the little globe icon at the bottom right hand of your screen, you should see there, and click the language that you would like to listen to or speak in. If you should see an option for English, Spanish, or French. So feel free to check any of those. If you have original audio, you will not get interpretation. So original, I do not avoid. I would suggest to avoid. So click English if you're an English speaker, French if French, Spanish if Spanish. And if you do not want to hear anything but that language, you can click mute original audio. Captions will be enabled at the bottom of the screen, so you should be able to see those. And we really encourage you to use the chat function frequently today. If you'll go ahead and start by putting your name, pronouns, where you're joining from today, it'd be great to get to see who all's on the call. You can also put any questions or thoughts that you have in the chat box throughout today's session. We will be closely monitoring that, and we'll make sure any questions that are included there are added to the queue for the speakers later in the session. We do ask, though, that you not have any artificial intelligence note-taking chatbots engaged for the call, just for security purposes. If you do have a chatbot running, please disable it now, or we will need to ask you to leave. We will be recording and sharing today's webinar, though, but we may cut portions if needed to support the safety and well-being of all of our speakers. So before I move into the agenda, just a quick moment of thanks to gratitude for those who made this report possible today. First, the many, many donors that submitted their data for the report. It is impossible to put together this kind of research without you, and it's really an important statement of our shared commitment to funding the HIV response. Second, this year's report was reviewed and guided by a number of peer funders, fellow philanthropy serving organizations, and advocates. Mauro Cabral Greenspan from the Global Philanthropy Project, Michael Igadaro from the Prevention Access Campaign, Ali Journeau from Arcus Foundation, Coco Jervis from Mama Cash, Elisa Fairlother from Funders for LGBTQ Issues, Charles Stevens, the Counter Narrative Project, and Mark Vermeulen from AIDS Funds all were critical and did some pre-reading and responses, and we're really thankful to you. We also thank as well our donors that supported the report through project and general operating support grants, including Broadway Cares, Equity Fights AIDS, the Levi Strauss Foundation, and Gilead Sciences. Finally, I want to thank our amazing board of directors. They push us to continue to elevate this work, and my colleague, Kat Gironda, who's the guiding force and brilliance behind all of this project that you'll see today, both the report and the website we're launching. So with that, we have a full agenda today. We're going to start with an introduction by Jesse Mylan from AIDS United. We'll then have an overview of key findings from the report by Kat, a panel of donors and community organizations facilitated by Mark Vermillion from AIDS Funds. And then we'll have a Q&A for everybody, including Kat and all of the speakers. So as I said, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll come back to them. So with that, I'd like to invite Jesse to join us. It's my honor to introduce Jesse Mylan Jr., the president and CEO of AIDS United, a national organization focused on grant making, policy, and capacity building with the mission of ending AIDS in the US. Mr. Mylan is also the board chair of Funders Concerned About AIDS and a new member of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, PACHA. Jesse, if you'll help ground us with some context and help us understand what's at stake right now, bring some energy to this conversation like you tend to, we'd be most grateful. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mason, and hello, everyone. I'm Jesse Mylan, President and CEO at AIDS United, and in my role today as chair of the board of Funders Concerned About AIDS, I'm thrilled to welcome you on behalf of all of FCAA's members to this webinar.
Au nom de
FCAA.
This report is about our members and our ally partners who are bold and proud funders of the fight to end the HIV epidemic, not only in our home countries, but around the world. Our latest report covers the year 2021, which was the 40th year since the HIV virus was identified and the scourge and destructions of AIDS began. But this year, 2023, when we're releasing this report, is also a milestone year. This year is the 40th anniversary of the Denver Principles, where a handful of men with AIDS traveled to a conference in Denver and launched the movement for meaningful involvement of people with AIDS, or MIPA, which we know today more broadly as meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. And we know its declaration that's been heard around the world of nothing for us without us. And as a person myself living with HIV, I'm proud that FCAA's members embrace this principle in all of our grant making and in all of our work. I'm proud to share also, on behalf of all funders, that 2023 is also the 40th year since the first private sector grant for HIV was made. And over these 40 years, FCAA members and the philanthropic community have provided trailblazing and sometimes even foundational support for all aspects of our fight against this disease, from pioneering research to grassroots prevention, treatment, and care services, from sexual and reproductive health services to, yes, syringe exchange services. Private sector philanthropy has augmented where government resources were inadequate, and private sector philanthropy has stepped in and funded efforts that governments often ignored, or like advocacy that governments simply cannot do. And FCAA has been tracking those private sector grants for years. And the report we released today is another milestone because, as Mason just said, this is FCAA's 20th report that tracks philanthropy resources for ending the HIV epidemic. So congratulations to FCAA and to our amazing staff for this wonderful report. This report will be a valuable tool for funders and for advocates alike. It describes funding flows that help identify gaps and opportunities, and the information in it can also help build partnerships and also encourage transparency. And its data can help make the case for unmet needs in key populations and in highly impacted regions. But most importantly, this report can foster critical conversations like the ones we're going to have today, where funders and community members can be in conversation to strategize and collaborate, to lift up challenges and successes, and to work towards our common goal to mobilize resources for ending the HIV epidemic and support communities most impacted that can lead to greater health equity and, most of all, to longer and healthier lives. And this report is a tool that I hope, that FCAA hopes, can be used for building the case in this very frightening political environment for why both private and public sector support is needed. Philanthropy alone cannot pick up the great mantle that's been cast by the PEPFAR program. But recent right-wing efforts in Congress are threatening PEPFAR's reauthorization. And those same political forces in Congress are threatening to terminate the Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative in the US and to drastically reduce funding for the Minority AIDS Initiative, for the Ryan White program, the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS program, and for HIV prevention at the CDC. Philanthropy alone cannot end this epidemic, but philanthropy must continue being a willing partner to augment what taxpayers' resources cannot fund, what insurers do not cover, and what government agencies are unable or unwilling to support. And much more is needed. Today, 1/3 of the people living with HIV around the world are not yet virally suppressed. Millions are still unaware of U equal U, or undetectable equals untransmittable. And millions are unaware and have no access yet to PrEP. Stigma and discrimination continue, and political forces are promoting anti-gay and anti-trans legislation with unparalleled animus and with plain and simple hate. Our work is not done, but the report released today shows that our work is continuing and making an important impact around the world. FCAA members and our funder allies are essential players in ending the HIV epidemic, and we have been since the first grant was awarded 40 years ago, and we remain so today. But we need more partners, more commitments that can be reported in a document like this. So if you're concerned about racial justice, if you're concerned about sexual health, if you're concerned about human rights and equity, you must be concerned about HIV and AIDS. And funders concerned about AIDS will continue being the forum where we support the goal of ending the HIV epidemic. So thank you. Thank you to all FCAA members and to our ally partners. AIDS United and I are proud to be part of this organization, and we're very proud to be part of this report. So thank you all. Mason, back over to you. Let's dig into this report.
All right, Jesse, thank you so much for that call to action, a reminder why we're here. Let's dig into the data now. Kat Geronda is the Research and Program Manager at FCAA. She has been with our organization for 7 years now and has helped to grow and advance our resource tracking project globally and greatly. Kat, I know you have been living and breathing this data for months now. Can you share some of the top line findings? Tell us what you've learned.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Jesse, for grounding us. I think having that context so that we're all on the same page has been a really important piece of this 20th edition of our report. And I think that we are, we need to hold that political context in mind as we move through this data, because I think that that lens has really been a key part of how we're seeing and understanding what's happening right now in the field. Like Mason said, I'm Kat Geronda, or Caterina Geronda. I use she, her pronouns, and I have long brown hair, curly brown hair, and a gray sweater on today. So I'm going to dive in. I know we have a lot happening on today's webinar, and I want to try and move through this fairly quickly. So the top line numbers from our report this year, $692 million in total philanthropic support to address HIV and AIDS was tracked in 2021. That's coming from 187 funders in the form of 5,600 grants going to about 2,800 grantee organizations. Now that's just about a 1% decrease from what we tracked in 2020. And in 2020, it was just about a 1% increase from the previous year. So when you look at it in that capacity, it doesn't seem like a huge fluctuation. It seems like we're having fairly stagnant funding from philanthropy. So we did an analysis thinking about how inflation has been impacting funding over time. This chart goes back to 2007. And you can see in sort of nominal dollars, the pink line on the bottom, you see, fluctuations over time, but kind of a steady increase. And really, when we adjust for inflation in 2021 dollars and we go back to 2007, we're really seeing fluctuations over time, but more of a steady decline. And that's kind of one of the red flags that we're throwing up today, thinking about how the philanthropic response is showing up and given the context and the political needs that we have. As usual, we look at the top 20 grant makers in our report, and this chart shows that list. Gilead Sciences at number 1 for the second year in a row, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at number 2, we had Vive Healthcare at number 3. And we see that continued concentration of funding at the top that we've seen in previous years. 92% of that $692 million is coming from the top 20 funders, and 66%, almost 2/3, from the top 2 funders alone. And so we flag that concentration of funding because we know that the stability of the field and the longevity of funding really has some precarity to it when you know the reliance that you have on a few funders. We did have some new funders on the top 20 list this year. Silicon Valley Community Foundation at the number 4 slot. For those of you following, you'll know that that's an anomaly. We did track a significant amount of funding, almost $31 million, mostly coming through a donor advised fund, but it was so specific and HIV related that we felt like it was valuable to include in the report this year. We saw American Jewish World Service on the top 20 list for the first time in that key intersectional funding that we've been highlighting. And we saw UHI, East African activist fund, coming up on the top 20 list. And they did significantly increase their funding this year, which was really exciting to see. But again, we know that there are concerns about some of the funders on this top 20 list potentially moving away from the field. And there's already been announcements about folks who are declining their HIV funding or closing those programs. And so we don't know if we're going to see Silicon Valley again come in at that level. And we know that there are other funders that may be leaving. And so something we're trying to flag and keep an eye on. I do want to use this moment before I dive into the data more thoroughly to situate philanthropic funding in that larger global funding context. This chart here in the orange, you'll see that this is looking at total resources for HIV and AIDS in low and middle income countries. And this data coming from UNAIDS and Kaiser Family Foundation, we see that 60% of domestic government response, 60% of funding, is coming from domestic government responses. And we know that domestic governments sometimes are not going to be funding populations that are criminalized by those governments themselves. We know that 37% of funding is coming from donor government responses, including bilateral and multilateral sources. And we know that there's politicization of the reauthorization of PEPFAR, as Jesse was talking about. And we still have, in addition to that, a funding gap to reach the UNAIDS estimated $29 billion annual target for 2025. And so in that context, we see philanthropy's 2% as pivotal in helping to reach these goals, right? Pivotal in funding those communities that domestic governments are not going to fund, like sex workers, people who use drugs, LGBTQ communities who are often criminalized within certain countries. We know that PEPFAR, we know that philanthropy's funding is pivotal in supporting advocacy to ensure that there is a clean reauthorization of PEPFAR, to ensure that global funding is maintaining and increasing, and to encourage that public response to reach that ultimate goal and to sustain the funding at the level that we need. So many ways, the same thing that Jesse was talking about, that philanthropic response is a key part of this larger picture. And I just wanted to have that context before we move forward. We have a new section in the report this year that we called What You Need to Know, and really foregrounded it up front. We wanted to highlight some of the issue areas and some of the populations that we understand as intersectional areas where funders are responding to the HIV epidemic and where their response is critical. And here you'll see highlighted in the green box are areas where we saw increases to those issue areas and populations, and in the red box where we saw decreases this year. And I'm going to dive into a few of those, but I encourage you to go into the report and look more closely at that. In each section, we'll talk about how philanthropy's response has looked over a number of years. So we have trends for 4 to 7 years on how that funding has looked. We'll talk about why that funding is important at that intersection and what the response and the change has been from the previous year. And I'll just dive into a few of those today. We saw that general operating funding dropped in 2021. So it totaled 45 million, which was a 17% decrease from 2020. That's only 7% of overall HIV-related philanthropy. And over the past 4 years, we see a trend line of flat funding over time with fluctuations up and down each year. In 2020, we did see a big jump in funding in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, presumably. There was a hope that this strategy would be sustained, that this flexible funding that was being offered would be sustained, at least through the remainder of the pandemic. But we did see that funding drop back down in 2021, along with total COVID-19 related funding. Here, looking at the COVID-19 related funding coming from philanthropy, we saw coming in at 48 million in 2021, so a 27% or $18 million decrease just 1 year after the onset of COVID. We did a little examination to see if there was any funding into long COVID at this point. Just 2 grants were showing up, or less than 1% of total funding. But hopefully we'll see more attention on the long-term impacts of COVID as we move forward in the years. We did see that the portion of that COVID-related funding that went to BIPOC communities in the US and to LGBTQI communities globally both increased in 2021, showing that there are funders prioritizing these heavily impacted populations in their COVID response grants. When we look at advocacy funding in 2021, it reached an all-time high of 150 million. So that's a $20 million or 15% increase from 2020, which itself had seen a $13 million increase from the prior year. So almost a quarter of all HIV philanthropy is for advocacy-related work. That kind of work includes activities to reduce stigma and discrimination, legal services, programs to reduce gender-based violence, as well as films and other communications to increase general HIV awareness and awareness of stigma. We understand that this funding is such a pivotal lever and an area that is uniquely advantageous for philanthropy to support. So
tenido y esperamos de que
in that funding, it might be. We did see funding for key populations at a new high this year at 110 million. That's about 16% of all HIV-related philanthropy. But we do know that key populations and their sexual partners account for 70% of all people living with HIV in the world. So a significant gap between funding and needs here, and another opportunity for funders to equitably support those most impacted by HIV. We look at key population funding in this chart and in the aggregate where we deduplicate. So we know that many grants go to MSM communities and trans communities, or to sex workers and people who use drugs. And we deduplicate, so we're only counting one grant a single time in this calculation, but we also have a disaggregated view of that funding. So you can look at funding for transgender communities, men who have sex with men, people who use drugs, and sex workers over the years. Looking at those last 2 columns from 2020 to 2021, we did see increases for all of those individual populations except for trans communities. For sex workers, the first time that we saw an increase in funding, it had been a decline in funding for sex workers for a long time, and then flat funding essentially. So a small increase, but positive, an increase for people who use drugs and MSM. But looking at that blue line from 2020 to 2021, you see that it's actually a slight decline. And we know the attacks that trans communities have been suffering in the US and globally. And so again, another opportunity for philanthropy to very strategically support those communities. This year we have a whole section looking at top 10 funder lists for different populations and issue areas. And as much as we love to celebrate the work that funders are doing, there's also a larger mission here, right? We want funders to see how their efforts are critical in that their funding, whether it's big or small, is among those top 10 sources of philanthropic HIV funding, right? So understanding that even if you think that the work that you're doing might be coming in on a minimal scale, you might find yourself on some of these top 10 lists, and understand that how value and how important those grants that you're making are. We also see this as an opportunity for funders and advocates to understand who else is doing work at these intersections, right? To advance partnerships, to advance collaboration, and to celebrate the fact that folks are submitting data, right? And the transparency that we see around just the data submission itself. So we hope that you'll take a closer look at these lists. We hope that you'll find yourself on them and see how valuable the work that you're doing is. Looking at the geographic distribution of funding, we have this map here, which looks at philanthropic funding percentages across the global regions, as well as the percentage of people living with HIV across the global region. And what you'll see is a disproportionate amount of funding going to Western and Central Europe and North America, 42% in that white bar, with only 6% of people living with HIV in those regions. And then you'll see, of course, the second most funded region, Eastern and Southern Africa, with 26% of funding, and yet 54% of people living with HIV in that region. And you'll see similar gaps in other regions in Western and Central Africa and Asia and the Pacific, and even areas like Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where the gap might seem smaller, 5% of people living with HIV, only 2% of funding, but we know that that's an area where new infections are increasing, one of the few areas in the world where new infections are increasing. So, so important to see this distribution of funding versus need. We also are diving in deeper into each of the global regions this year. So we have profiles that look at every region across the globe, and those are twofold. Part of that is having a narrative that was submitted by grantee partners and funders to talk about what the epidemic looks like in that region, the work that they're doing, and lifting up some of the voices of that response. And then partnering that with some of the data that we're going to find in the funding that's happening in each of those regions. So you'll see, for example, here, you'll have a top 10 funders list, you'll have the top 5 populations and intended use that are being funded, and you'll have a list of how that funding breaks down in each country within that region, as well as a couple other key data points like funding for key populations, as well as total funding, total number of funders, and total number of people living with HIV. So we really encourage you to dive into these profiles, and the place where you can dive into those profiles, I'm really excited to announce, is our new online microsite where we're housing our report this year. So it's resourcetracking.fcaaids.org. We'll put it in the chat. You should have received an e-blast with it this morning as well. It's the first time that we've presented the data in this format. So you're not just going to have a single downloadable PDF that you'll find online, but you'll be able to click into each section of the report. You'll be able to click onto images and zoom in on the graphs. You'll be able to go to the regional profile sections and download individualized PDFs for each of those regions, as well as a number of other ways you can interact with the data. We also have a full archive of the 20 years of our report that you can access and download there as well. So really excited about this. Really hope that folks find it valuable. It's also a useful way if you want to point back to a single piece of data, that you can do that by individualizing the link and pointing folks to a particular location. So so I hope you dive in and enjoy that. I know that was a lot, and I know that we have a lot more coming. I'm wrapping it up with just a quick recap, right? To say, here's what you heard me say. 1% decrease in overall funding, but when we look at inflation, we're really seeing a steady decline over time. We see that concentration of funding in the top 20 list and in the top 2 funders especially. We know that funders are decreasing and moving away from HIV, and we know that that's happening in the context of public funding and communities that are under attack. So we have concerns there. We saw general operating support and COVID-19 funding decline in the heart of the pandemic, when we know that flexibility was needed the most. But we did see advocacy reach an all-time high, and we know that that's one of the strongest levers philanthropy can offer. We know that funding for key populations increased, but funding for trans communities stalled. And we know that philanthropic funding is not evenly distributed across the globe as needed, according to need. So just a few ways to kind of summarize what we heard today. And a lot of what I see here are opportunities for funders to respond and to figure out how to plug in. I'll wrap up by just saying we've already done the bulk of our call for data for 2022 funding, but if you've missed that, or if you know that you're funding or you're an intermediary and you want to submit and be a part of this report, please reach out to me. My email is on the slide there. We have maybe another month that we can accept data. We'll have some forthcoming analyses. We'll do an update on funding for EHE communities. We'll have deep dives and data infographics, probably one forthcoming on children and youth. And we want to hear from you. So if there's things you want to see, if there's feedback that you have, if there's ways that you can tell us that we can make this report more useful for you, please do be in touch. We'd love to have your feedback. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Mason so he can move us forward and we can have a wonderful conversation with our panelists.
Kat, thank you so much for all of this, the great presentation and the great work. There's so much richness in this report, and the more I dig into it, the more excited I am, and it's beautiful. So I really do encourage people to check it out and the microsite. We want to get some perspective on what the data means for those most impacted by the HIV epidemic from different regions of the world. So to facilitate this discussion, I want to encourage Mark Vermeulen to join us. Mark is the Executive Director of AIDS Funds and the Vice Chair of the FCAA Board of Directors. Mark brings 10 years of experience in the international fight around HIV and AIDS. Having lived with HIV since 2007, he has a strong personal commitment to the movement that aims to put an end to AIDS. Mark, if you'll please join us to moderate this next conversation, speak slower than I do for the interpreters, and invite our panelists to join us as well.
Great. Thank you, Mason. And hello, everyone. My name is Mark Vermeulen, pronouns he, him, Executive Director of AIDS Funds, not as blonde as I used to be, more and more gray and tallish and Dutch. And really excited to be hosting this panel. And thank you, Kat, for taking us through that huge amount of information, but also really excited to be able to moderate this panel to make some sense of what this means. Just a reminder, we'll have a short, I think 20 to 30 minutes panel discussion, but also if you have any questions, please keep posing them in the chat. And at the end, we'll have 15 minutes to address those questions by the panelists, but also by Kat. So also if you have questions for her, please post them in the chat. I'm really excited to be joined today by three activists and community leaders from basically around the world. I will ask them to introduce themselves more elaborately and also reflecting on the report, but just to ask them to join us, Caroline Kusiamani from ISDAO in Western Africa. She's the Executive Director of ISDAO. Viet Trinh from Lighthouse Social Enterprise in Vietnam. He is the Programs Director there. And Marcia Jones, co-founder and ED from the FIA Center in Texas in the US. So thank you all for joining us here. You had a chance to look at this report. You had a conversation. We had the conversation just now with Kat and her presentation. And it would be great to get your different perspectives from the fields that you're working in, the different environments that you're working in, and to just start off. So I want to start, if that's okay, with you, Caroline. If you can shortly introduce yourself, but also give us a reflection on this report, including some of the concerns you might have on funding levels concerning the region that you're working in, for example, or some of the communities that you're working in. So please, if you're with us, Caroline, introduce yourself and give us some reflections.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you everyone for making time to be a part of this important conversation. As Mark said, my name is Caroline Kwasi-Ama. I am joining this call from cold Berlin, which is why I have a turtleneck sweater on. I'm much in much warmer attire than I usually am, living in West Africa. And I have a gray sweater on, glasses, short hair. And I'm the executive director of ISDAO. ISDAO is an LGBTQI West African activist-led fund. We're a feminist organization working to advance a more just and inclusive West Africa, particularly through participatory grant making. And I'm here wearing two hats because I'm wearing the ISDAO hat, but also wearing a Love Alliance hat. And we are a part of Love Alliance, which is a partnership, a 5-year partnership funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to really advance community-led solutions and leadership to advancing sexual reproductive health and rights, particularly as we look at some of the larger goals of what we're trying to achieve with increased access to services, access to information, working to create a more just world, ending sexual and gender-based violence. What we feel is really important is to support the leadership of the communities most affected, particularly thinking about LGBTQI communities, sex workers, and people who use drugs. So that's really our focus within the Love Alliance. And we work across 10 countries across the region. And Love Alliance is actually highlighted as one of the case studies on page 68 of the report. So I won't tell you all of the good stuff. I'll let you read it for yourself. But just some reflections on the report. I mean, I think there's some encouraging aspects. It's very easy to kind of look at the big picture of actually funding is decreasing or relatively stable, and where we know the needs are increasing. But I think it's important first to celebrate some of the advances and to recognize the increase in funding, proportion of funding going to advocacy, especially when we know that oftentimes philanthropic HIV funding is the sole or primary source of funding for many organizations. And I will speak specifically in our region, across sub-Saharan Africa, but I can speak specifically for West Africa. Philanthropic funding for HIV is where that funding exists. And especially when we're talking about communities who fall under the key populations who are most often criminalized, the ability to have resources to do the critical work around advocacy is so essential. It's also important to celebrate the increase in resources for social services. And we saw that that spiked up in 2020, of course, with the COVID epidemic, the height of the COVID epidemic. In general, it's been increasing when you look at the data since 2015, 2016, but it's a little bit, I think we celebrate the growth and celebrate that the philanthropic community kind of rose to the moment and increased both general support and support for social services in 2020, even though that has not necessarily been sustained as much, but that's in recognition of the reality of our communities. And so I think that's something to celebrate. I think, of course, the data that Kat shared around increase in funding for key populations being on the upward trend overall, even though there's disparity within the group, is an important thing to celebrate. And especially as we know that criminalization and increased criminalization, which is happening due to the growth of anti-rights, anti-gender movements, is on the rise. The importance of support to communities that are most affected is really important. I think maybe just one or two other things that I'll mention very quickly. The data, and this is maybe on the less celebratory side, the data about the concentration of funding being in the hands of so few funders is alarming. When we're looking at 92% of funds coming from the top 20 funders, and this is all of philanthropic funding for the HIV response, that's concerning. 78% of the funding came from just the top 5. And this is particularly concerning when we look at sustainability of our work, and also expanded needs. And I think the COVID epidemic has also highlighted that there's many other needs that HIV funding has not historically taken into account or has been a part of our work. But also we recognize that the report highlights that there are some shifts in funders leaving the sector. And there's an important question that we need to ask about what's happening. Where's that money going? Is it being reoriented in a different way? Is it completely leaving the sector? Is it supporting maybe broader sector-wide approaches? And we also know that even since this report, there's been several key transitions. So for example, the transition of Open Society Foundation's funding, which OSF has historically been one of the strongest supporters of sex worker and people who use drugs organizing, that transition of that funding has a significant impact. And I'll share in the chat, there's a link for a webinar that's taking place next month, looking at research of the impact of that gap of OSF's transition on funding for sex worker organizing. That's a really important continuation of this conversation. I think I'll end here because I could go much longer, and I'll touch again on some of the other pieces of how do we as a community, philanthropic communities, support communities in this current moment of anti-rights movements, and a little bit later if we have time.
Great, Caroline. Thank you so much for kicking us off. And I think you're addressing some really important issues. I think really nice that you started out so positively, but I think also some concerns that hopefully we'll have some time to discuss with the rest of the panel. So thank you very much. Next, I'd like to go to Viet Thrin. Like I said, Program Director from Lighthouse Social Enterprise in Vietnam. Also for you, the question, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, but also give your first reflections on the report? I already saw you nodding when Caroline was talking about the importance of funding for advocacy, but please introduce yourself and give us your reflections.
Thanks, Mark, for noticing my nodding, vigorous like nodding when it comes to advocacy, and I feel like that's like the main reason why that I'm here today, and so are all of you. So again, hello everyone. My name is Viet Mason Tring. You could call me Mason. I use he/him/his pronouns. Currently, I'm having like a striped '80s vintage shirt with black hair. Just a bit about myself. Currently, I'm serving as the Director of Programs here at Lighthouse Social Enterprise. So what we are is that we are a civil society organization here in Vietnam, and we're a leading organization, community-based organization focused on health equity for young key populations and LGBTQ plus youth. Specifically, our key areas are HIV and AIDS and mental health. And yeah, like again, I feel like a key fun fact here is that we're the founder and also the annual organizer of the Vietnam annual LGBTQ plus summit. Just a little bit about my observations when it comes to this report. I think a lot of the insights that Caroline already shared definitely are things that I really resonate with, especially when it comes to, you know, like geographical distribution of HIV related like philanthropy funding. As you can see, like in the report, I think like Kat already shared very well that there exists like this discrepancy when it comes to, you know, like funding distribution, despite the fact that certain regions, if not have, you know, like a higher burdens of you know, like a disease when it comes to HIV and AIDS, but that does not equate with equal funding or equitable funding dedicated to that region. And I feel like for Asia Pacific, you know, for my region, I could really speak to that. So in the report, you could see that Asia Pacific is home to at least 15% of you know, like people living with HIV around the world. And that is very second place, you know, to Eastern and Southern Africa. But this region only receives, you know, like a very small slice of the cake, which is 2% of the entire global funding when it comes to HIV related like philanthropy funding. And given this, you know, like this fact, you know, like HIV, I mean, like Asia Pacific is very underfunded, given its plethora of challenges. Even when, you know, like this region receives funding from a lot of like philanthropists, a lot of the money actually goes to research institutes or partners who serve directly the government. So a lot of the money that is being distributed is actually going in, you know, like to like like the government here. And I think like the report already like highlights a very important fact that a lot of the money from like bilateral and also multilateral partners are also going into the governments. And I feel like, you know, given this fact, a very small slice of the cake is actually going, you know, like to the community itself. And that explains the reason why that even though a lot of philanthropy, you know, do fund a lot of community-based like initiatives, like they're not really that impactful and like innovative enough because like the pockets of money are not really dedicated, you know, to the community. And that's one of the things that I really want to highlight. The second thing that I really also want to highlight is the fact that the top three population of focus for funding for Southeast Asia and East Asia include general population, people living with HIV, and women and girls. This top three is this top three may not be reflective of the like the epidemic here in the region, because the bulk of the epidemic is concentrated among key populations. If not, the majority remain you know, like among men who have sex with men. So as we're comparing, you know, like what we're doing and you know, like the epidemic as it is on the grounds, we could see that there's that stark you know, contrast, and perhaps that could call for more intentional, you know, shifts towards key populations and if not men who have sex with men, because perhaps, you know, like in this region, like the epidemic looks a little bit different. And I guess like I will leave at like the last thing, and that would be, I think, like in the report, something that was really intriguing to me was that even though there was like that huge bump up, you know, like for funding in terms of advocacy, I think there was like like an 11% increase compared to you know, 2019, and also like a 26% for I mean, like that was for advocacy, and like a 26% increase for social services. And I feel like there are a lot of like increases, but a lot of that, money again are not being translated into the funding that we're seeing here at the community levels. A lot of community-based like organizations or a lot of civil society organizations do not directly receive those, like funding pockets. It could be through like intermediaries or bigger institutes, but like a lot of that funding may not translate into the community level. So yeah, like I'll just leave it at that, and I'm sure that we'll have more points for discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Mason, and thank you for pointing out the importance for data and reflecting on that. And I think you pointed at some really concerning discrepancies. And I think a second point that you're raising is the importance of also addressing where is that funding going? Is it actually reaching the communities and community organizations that are often frontline and first-line responders? So thank you for addressing these issues. And again, hopefully we'll have some time to come to that. Thirdly and lastly, I want to introduce Marcia, founder and executive director of AFIA Center in Texas in the US. Also, to you, Marcia, the question, could you shortly introduce yourselves and give us your reflections on the report and what you've been hearing so far?
Yes, good morning, evening, afternoon, everyone. I think I covered all of that. I am in Texas. I'm, as said, Marcia Jones, and I'm one of the founders and executive director of the AFIA Center. I'm currently wearing like exaggerated cat frame brown glasses, kind of got grayish twists in my hair. They're kind of like slightly under my ears, hair is slightly under my ears. I have a real interesting blazer on. It's yellow, it's blue jean, it's yellow, it's white, it's like a turquoise, and it's pinstripe. So that's me today. So the AFIA Center, we're located in Texas. I don't know if it makes me happy or sad to say that we are currently the only reproductive justice organization here founded by Black women who unapologetically serve Black women where Black women reside. So we're excited that we get to do that in a state like Texas, a blood red state. With the goal, we hope that one day that will change, and perhaps we'll be able to say the first, but not the only. The AFIA Center was established in response to increasing disparities between HIV among Black women and other folk. And before we started the organization, it was like there was a question asked, is the work that you all going to do, is it already being done? If so, then you join with who's already doing it. But when we looked at it, when we looked at what was happening in Texas and in Dallas specifically, we did not see it. We did not see people addressing HIV prevention. And for those folk living with HIV, from a human rights and social justice lens, we saw a lot of things based on behavior, how you changing behaviors and all that, but we did not see that thing. And so one of the things that I've always been very clear about is that if you change the conditions that folk are living in, it automatically changes the behavior. And so if you pay people a living wage, they'll eat better food. if you do those things, if you provide housing, then people don't have to make those kind of interesting negotiations in order to be safe and have safe housing. And sometimes those interesting negotiations can be how they have sex, right? And who they have sex with. And so I just thought it was interesting that we wanted to task folk with negotiating safe sex who did not have the tools to negotiate life. So I didn't see that. So we said, well, we're going to do that at the AFIA Center. We're not going to talk about condoms. We're not going to talk about behavior. We're not going to talk about all of that. We're going to fight these systems. We're going to fight to deconstruct a set of systems that's been put in place to harm a particular group of people. So that's our work. And I always give homage to what brought me into this work many, many years ago in the early 80s, 90s. I heard these conversations around what was going to happen to gay men. and they were going to be dead. You know, this disease, they were going to all be dead. And I looked around at my friends, and at that time, because the nearest dearest person to my heart was my nephew Jimmy, who was a gay man, I said, "Oh God," and his friends were my friends, and I said, "Oh, my friends are going to be dead." I didn't know that I was speaking truth, because you see, today I have no Black gay men who were my friends in the 80s. They're all dead. And so that is really where my heart and my passion lie in this work. That's what brought me here. But it was coming here that I found out that there were another group of people who were just as invisible as Black gay men. And that group of people were Black women. And so that's why we do the work here at the Afia Center. We're 100% committed to love and serve Black women. And as long as I'm the executive director, we will always center, love, and serve Black women. What stuck out with me with this, like, there's so much already said. I already knew. I was really happy I was coming behind Caroline, because the way she hopefully I said that right. I didn't catch your pronouns at the beginning, but the way you present that just set it all in place. So there's not even a whole lot more to say. But the only thing that I will say, like, hats off to that. I appreciate the increase in funding, especially when I looked at increase in funding for women. I am still concerned about that. I'm concerned that it took so long to get there, but also, will it continue? Because in order for us to properly and to be successful, and I mean, we got 7 years, we got literally 7 years if we're going to reach a goal, right? A 2030 goal. And at the rate funding is happening, it scares me that we're not going to reach that goal again. So, and I'm wondering, are we going to push that number up again, that year up again? And so that kind of stuck with me. I was like, yeah, that's good. I'm not really satisfied with any decrease in funding, no matter what the reasons are. There cannot be fluctuating in funding if we're going to do this work. There have to be a steady incline. It can't even be like a peak. There have to be a steady incline. People have to be invested in the lives of folk living with HIV, and that's not even a single issue that you're looking at, because when you're invested in such a vulnerable population that impacts such vulnerable people, it is all things, not one thing. So that is a thing that stuck out with me the most. I was happy to see the increase in funding. But I will say that increase in funding did not find its way to a lot of the space. It was while we did receive funding around 2020 that we had never received before, we also lost funding that I don't think we should have lost because our work did change, And so also being in Texas, I don't necessarily think that funding found its way to women-centered spaces. And I always tell people, just because you serve women don't mean you center women, and there is a difference there. There's research that have said that the place that Black women feel the most isolated is in aid service organizations. Now make that make sense. And so I just, that was another thing, making sure that funding finds its way to those folk who are doing the work for the folk that we say that we want to see funded. So as I go down that line, that is my way of thinking, and I start talking about that, I could go on and on. So I'm going to stop there because I know that we will have another question. But yeah, that is the one thing that I thought about, making sure that funding continues to go up, not even go flat, but go up, and it absolutely cannot go down. And the advocacy piece. And so there, you had already talked about that advocacy. I may be sitting here as the ED, but I will be an advocate all my life, on the ground, grimy, in the dirt, advocacy, doing the work for the folk that I love.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcia, for telling us a little bit about your history and your passion for this work. And I see a lot of love. Love is coming through in the Love Alliance, but also in the focus that you just brought out. Just looking at time, I'm just suggesting for people to please keep posing your questions in the chat. We'll come to you, but just dive right into the second question, building on, I think, what has been shared. I think Kat also mentioned it. If we're looking around the world, we see a huge pushback on rights for LGBTI plus people, women's rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights. At the same time, we are also seeing a decrease in a lot of public funding. a question to all of you, and then perhaps to see who wants to go first. What role can and should philanthropy play in this world when at the same time we saw that only 2% of that total amount of funding is philanthropic funding? So what can and should philanthropic funding and funders focus on when it comes to this huge movement that we're seeing pushing back on rights all across? Who wants to go first in what I realize is a very big question, but I think it ties into nicely with the points being made about the importance of advocacy and reaching those communities on the ground. Who can I invite to answer this question or start a reaction to this? Yeah, Marcia, you want to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
yeah.
I was
Yeah.
trying to find the thing. So I think that over the years, there's been like a concentrated effort to fund services, to fund these things. I think just here recently, there's been almost a push around or a need or a nudge to fund along the lines of reproductive health and rights and justice. And I think that to fund reproductive justice type of work is definitely a way to get us closer to ending the epidemic. And I think in the political landscape that we find ourselves in now, especially in the United States, I won't try to speak outside of the United States, the political landscape that we find ourselves in right now, it is going to be imperative that philanthropy step in and really fill those gaps, because everything that we work for, everything that we stand for, the government stand against. And so when we're looking at the harm that happens in the LGBTQI community, when we look at the harm that's happening with Black folk, when we look at what's happening with Black women who want to birth, being in the South, being in these red spaces where we won't even provide health care, Medicaid in that form, and we look at folk who don't want to birth, and it's almost legal to not want to birth or to take the necessary steps to not go full term with a pregnancy, and then understanding that that can be magnified if you're a person living with HIV and you happen to be somewhere where just the idea that you may be having sex that could transmit, or that could, because we're not even going to think about what the science say, that don't mean anything, or that you may think about being pregnant, or that this may have happened by way of having sex, that somebody may get it in their idea in their head, oh, we can criminalize that too. So there's so many ways like what can happen here is so great. And the government has such a strong hand on this right now that if we're not funding reproductive justice, health, and rights, and making sure that we're talking about reproductive justice, health, and rights, we are absolutely talking about folk living with HIV. When we're talking about funding stuff that builds bodily autonomy, absolutely we're talking about folk, LGBTQI folk. If we're not having this one centralized conversation and having the resources in order to do this work, then we're going to make our 2030 deadline. So I think that the way in which philanthropy can really show up is to be able to fund this work that don't have to be so closely aligned to what the government will or will not say is okay or can be approved. So for me, and I guess that's because our work is 100% centered and done by the lens of reproductive justice, health, and rights. That is the one place that I believe that funders, that's where funders have full autonomy, right?
Yeah.
To fund their work. So that's where I feel.
No, so thank you, Marcia. I think a very strong plea for philanthropic funding to be courageous and to show up and to look where the gaps are. Caroline, can I ask you to jump in and add to this, or perhaps offer a different perspective?
Yeah. No, I'm really glad that Marcia went first on this one, because I think she set the stage beautifully. And I mean, this ties into what I wanted to share. When you look at the data around general support, the percentage of funds that the HIV funding from philanthropy that is general support that's not increasing at the level that it needs to. Because what we need in moments like right now with anti-rights movements, anti-gender movements who are very well organized, very well resourced, is for community organizations that are doing this work to be able to have flexible resources that enable them to pivot, that enable them to change strategy where needed, to come together, to strategize, resources that enable to deploy, to rethink what is needed as situations evolve. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do as a philanthropic sector to meet the moment. And I think one of the key things that is necessary is increasing the amount of general support. I think that also, this moment, and I talked earlier about the increase in funding related to social service, and then it dropped back down. And that's concerning to me because what the COVID pandemic has really highlighted or really shown more light on is the importance of funding social services, the things that people need to survive and to thrive. And so we can't say that this is not an HIV issue, that food and housing and employment and economic security is not an HIV issue when it is. And so there's a lot more. I mean, clearly the data shows that funders can do better when it's a moment of crisis. Well, it's still a moment of crisis. And so I think that there is continued support. But the other thing is that as a philanthropic community, as we think about this moment and the attacks, it also requires the philanthropic community to think differently about what needs to be funded. For example, how are we thinking about strategic litigation, especially in places where there's new laws that are being introduced, new criminalizing laws that are being introduced? There's a need for funding for strategic litigation. There's a need for funding for legal representation. There's a need for funding for large-scale communications, campaigns, the kind of work that changes hearts and minds. That's not your regular grant type. That's not your regular grant size. It may not be to the usual suspects. We need funding to do opposition monitoring and opposition research. There is need for funding to support safe houses, emergency shelters, to support work around digital security, and also direct engagement with policymakers. And I can speak specifically for a West African context. That's not cheap. If you want to engage with policymakers, I mean, none of the things that I mentioned are cheap. And many of those are not things that the HIV philanthropy community is used to funding. And so I think this moment also requires that in addition to the core work and continuing to sustain organizations doing this work, is we also have to expand our toolkit. And we have to expand the resources for the toolkit. The final thing that I'll just mention is I think the importance of more support for collaborative, cross-movement, cross-issue work. Because oftentimes philanthropy kind of puts us in boxes around this community, this part of key populations, this constituency. And there's a lot more leadership that I think that the philanthropic community can do in actually supporting collaboration. Because when you look at these anti-rights actors, what they're attacking is transversal. I mean, so I can think about in our context in West Africa, they're coming for LGBTQI communities. They're coming for access to safe abortion. They're coming for comprehensive sexuality education. They're coming for many other issues. And so if we're only thinking from a one sector or one community or one constituency and not thinking or strategizing and don't have the resources to strategize broadly, we're always going to be behind. And so I think part of meeting this moment is also rethinking how funding can support movement building and movement strengthening that creates bridges rather than creates more silos.
Thank you, Caroline. Eloquent as ever. And I think flexibility stands out in what you're mentioning. Give community organizations the flexibility to be able to do what they find most important and challenging philanthropic institutions to think outside of the box. Thank you. Mason, finally to you, reflecting also on that question. What would you like to contribute to the discussion?
Yeah, totally. I feel like what Marsha and Caroline already mentioned are so important. And I feel like on a global scale, and if not in Asia Pacific, there have been and there are a lot of like political threats when it comes to LGBTQI plus rights, and a lot of like different movements such as like reproductive rights and also mental health as well. And I feel like as we understand, that there are always, like political threats, there needs more efforts, for like from funder sides, to promote the sustainability of integrating LGBTQI plus rights advocacy into HIV response. That perhaps is like the missing piece here. I feel like if we have like sustainability, there, even though like there are going to be like different like political threats, we're like pretty much like bulletproof here, and perhaps for and I feel like from the report, it's very clear that advocacy is like the top for, I guess, like funding area from a lot of different HIV related like philanthropy. I definitely do believe that not only do we have the power to, but we do have the responsibility to make that commitment in, like promoting sustainability and advocating for LGBTQ plus rights within HIV response. And the key reason why is the fact that, advocacy, and especially like LGBTQ plus rights advocacy, is always first on the list if government detects any receding international funding, which is currently happening. So that is already happening. So I think, like now, if not like ever, demands greater efforts, if not commitment, from a lot of funders to really collaborate together and promote this culture of like sustainability when it comes to integrating LGBTQ plus rights advocacy into HIV response. And the second thing that I think that I would like to highlight further, I think like Caroline like already mentioned, social services funding are so important. And one piece of one piece that I would like to highlight is the fact that mental health is often, very much sitting at the bottom of the barrel, even in social services. And interestingly, I feel like mental health may not be classified as like social services, but it's always given, like this place in there. I feel like it deserves more priority, and I definitely do think that we can make a commitment in making that a possibility, especially when the science and especially when economic science already tells us that if we're funding mental health when it comes to like HIV response, we're getting, like returned of investments, especially, like when it, like according to United, like Global Mental Health, for every single dollar that you're investing in integrating mental health into HIV response, you're getting like a return saving of $6.4 for every penny, like for every dollar you're investing. So I think that's a huge deal, for like the sustainability of funding HIV, like entirely, right? So I think definitely we need to make a commitment and also like a priority when it comes to funding mental health in tandem with HIV response. I feel like a clear like recommendation when it comes to that is that we could create like a separate funding stream for a lot of different intersecting, like health concerns. That could be mental health, that could be harm reduction, that could be TB, that could be STDs, but it has to be separate in order for it to be prioritized. I do not think that it could, like sit along like the side of other services, like under social services. Otherwise, it's always going to sit at the bottom of the barrel and it won't get enough funding. So I think that was like my take.
Thanks, Mason, for bringing us home in that sense, and for putting on the agenda also the important issue of mental health, but also the sustainability of these efforts. I'm looking at time as well. I just want to check in with our colleague from FCAA, Sarah Hamilton, who's been monitoring and also answering some of the questions in the chat. Sarah, is there one question that we could just take 1 or 2 minutes to address that you feel is really important for us to have the panelists the opportunity to have 1 or 2 to speak to that?
Sure, I'll do one question, and then I think some of the others that are left might be things that Mason, as part of his call to action and wrap up. But they're given like the top 20 list and looking at sort of what is private versus corporate. There's a question to ask you about the experience of what it's like as a grantee or a partner with those organizations in terms of if one or the other, corporate or kind of foundations, are willing to support general operating or advocacy versus program, if you could just reflect a little bit on what that experience has been like in this work.
Who wants to take that question? I think we have time for one person to address that. Is there anyone who can address that question that Sarah just posed to us? We have a very modest panel. Caroline, you want to go?
Yeah. I don't have an answer to that question. We don't have direct experience of corporate funding, so I wouldn't want to speak about something I don't have lived experience of. I think it's a great question. I'm curious to the answer. If others have experience with that, or Marcia or Mason, or maybe I know Mark as well as AIDS Fund. If you wanted to take your facilitator hat off, it might be something you want someone to reflect on.
I'll
try
just I'll try this a little bit. So we get absolutely no government funding like that, right? So when I look at it, because I've in past experience, I've been in places where I worked and they got it, or I know people who do. Our funding is private, corporate, and I will say now probably 90% of our funding is general programming. And it just allows us, sadly, the only funding we get that's just programming itself, except for like here lately now it's changed, is our HIV funding. Everything else is for the better part. It's like general programming. And so it gives us so much room. It gives us so much flexibility. It gives us so much the opportunity to work. Even small things like reporting. Those reports can just be so much, like so stressful. But the relationship that we have with our funders is so that sometimes just a quick phone call can satisfy a report. Sometimes, we can just literally pick up a phone and say, oh, we're going to have to change this and go in a different direction, or just being able to get funding to fund work that's not always able to be funded. So yeah, it just really, it changes our approach to the work, and it provides us an opportunity to really do the work of the people, in opposed to just doing the work that's just driven by data or just driven by numbers. And I know how important data is, but sometimes when you're doing the work on the street, you can see the impact of what needs to be done before the data can capture it and give it to the folks who's going to give the funding. So that's just a small way that I can answer it. It definitely do take a lot of pressure. Now, I don't mean that the value of the work that we're doing decreases any. No, it don't. There's still an expectation that we do what we say we're going to do. It's just that we have more room to move, to do the work that we say we're going to do. So that's my small answer.
Thank you, Marcia. I'm just looking at time, and I think we have I have 10 more questions at least, but I also want to give Mason the chance to round us up and to give his reflections on our session. So just from my end, I want to thank you, Mason, Caroline, Marcia, for being with us, for answering these questions. For other people having answered questions in the chat, we'll try to get back to you on the chat. And I think this, let's see if this is the start of a conversation, because I think there were very practical suggestions, but also some bigger reflections that really are worth more time investing our thinking in that. So with that, I want to hand it over to, I think, Mason to wrap us up.
I'll be Mason number 2 on this call.
Yeah.
Really just so grateful to our panelists. You all are so smart and committed. I'm really grateful for the work that you do every day. As we wrap this up, I really want to urge my colleagues in philanthropy and civil society alike, please use this tool as a way to help understand where and how philanthropy can and should and is responding to the HIV and AIDS epidemic. For civil society, I hope the data will help as you develop effective programs and advocate to hold all of us in the philanthropic field accountable to meeting the needs of those most impacted by HIV and AIDS. And for funders, I hope the data will help you identify gaps and opportunities in the funding landscape, to craft proactive and responsive grant-making strategies, and to work in partnership with others towards similar goals. We hope that all funders see their place in the report, whether you're big or small, regional or global, HIV specific or intersectional. We need a wide ecosystem of donors to really respond appropriately to the HIV and AIDS crisis. And as Caroline suggested, we need to talk as a field about where funds are going and where funders are going. We need to raise some red flags when we see long-term donors leaving the space. And I'm afraid, I'm concerned that some of the donors on the top 20 list this year may not be there next year, and some that have been here in prior years are not there in this year. That's a problem. We need to see and better understand where those funders and where those funds are going. If you're not funding communities most impacted by HIV and AIDS yet, I hope you'll be inspired to do so. Given the concentration of funding among just a few funders, and don't get me wrong, I'm so grateful those big funders exist. Like, thank you. Where would we be? And we can't just be reliant on a few donors. It's not healthy and sustainable for a movement. So given the concentration of funding, the stagnation of funding over time, and the increased needs and political attacks, it's time for actually more investment, not less. We need more donors and more donors funding at scale in this space. And we, as a field, need to better sustain and grow the people and the places with the highest HIV burden and risk these days. We need to continue to increase advocacy and organizing among and led by sex workers, people who use drugs, trans people, gay men and men who have sex with men, and broader LGBTQI communities. I am really struck by this percentage that 70% at least of all people living with HIV are in key populations, and yet only 16% of funding is going there. And we also need to encourage more funding in the global East and global South and the US South, where the number of people living with HIV far outpace the financial resources available. And in regions like Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the MENA region, where new infections and deaths continue to rise. You know, for 20 years now, FCAA has been releasing this report. Many of you have attended this many times. Every year you hear us say that we're concerned about the potential decline in HIV funding and the concentration of funding with just a few donors. That narrative has been present ever since 2003 in our first report. But you know, what's different this year is this politicization of HIV and AIDS and the real polarization that's happening around the world that is putting those most at risk of HIV and those most likely to be living with HIV at increased risk and threats of violence, discrimination, and lack of access to the care that they need. The threats to PEPFAR reauthorization we're seeing, the potential cuts to government funding around HIV, the attacks against LGBTQ communities that are rampant right now, all are really unhealthy for our communities, especially those most impacted by HIV and AIDS, and it makes philanthropy's role more critical than ever. This is a beginning conversation. It is not the end. FCAA is here for this. This is your organization, all right? We are a membership organization, and we want to be a part of the solution with you all in partnership and collaboration together. So I know there were some questions about what are we going to do based on this data. So there are a number of things we can do. You know, we are doing monthly webinars now and can do some deeper dives as their interest on various topics or populations. We are happy to go meet up at a conference to put together a session or a discussion to go deeper. We, have the ability to organize a half day or full day convening for those that are interested in particular topics or subjects, or to even develop a targeted working group. For example, we have one that's very active around funding gaps in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So please let us know where you'll be, what you would like for us, where we can be helpful, because absolutely this is it. We've got the data. That's where things begin. That's not where they end. It's time to turn this into philanthropic advocacy, and we are going to be so much more powerful if we do it together. So we will definitely be in Funding Forward in Chicago at the end of November. We're talking about ICASA. I know many of you have asked about that. We'll definitely be in Munich at AIDS 2024. All of these are opportunities for us to come together, and we will be organizing our own philanthropic conference as well we'll be sharing more information about that soon. So let's keep talking. Please, we will do our best to respond to questions via email as well if you want to send those to any of us on staff or the board. But with this, I want to be respectful of time. Thank you all for being in this together. Please share this document and resource, spread the word that we need more donors in this space. And we are here to do this work together and support our communities and get this to the finish line. So thank you so much, everybody, today, and we'll see you again soon.